Hello and welcome to everyone out there in the Actual Tech Media audience. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. We've got a really cool topic for today. That is the anatomy of a ransomware attack. I mean, this is a hot topic. Everyone out there in the IT industry, the tech world, is being impacted by ransomware one way or the other. And so this event is for you. We're going to look into the anatomy of what makes these attacks happen, how to prevent them, how to recover from them, how to respond, answer all your questions. It's going to be a great discussion. Before we get started, there's just a few things that you should know about the event today. First off, I should mention my name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'm glad to be serving as the host. We always want these events to be educational, so we encourage your questions there in the questions pane of the audience console. And we'll be doing a live Q&A session at the end of the event, so keep those questions coming during the presentation. We even have a best question prize to help maybe shake some of those questions loose. I'll talk about that more here in just a moment. But first, I want to call your attention there to the handouts tab. It's there that you'll find some great resources on today's topic, including the Rubrik and Insight Stop the Ransomware Pain Solution Guide. Make sure you check that out. Also check out the Rubrik Security Cloud PDF, as well as Rubrik for Microsoft 365. You can download those PDFs. You can click on the URL. That will open up a new web browser tab or window in your web browser, and you can check it out after the event. At the end of the webinar, I'll be having the pleasure of announcing the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card. If you're watching this on demand or recorded, of course, that drawing would have already occurred. The prize terms can be found right there in the handouts tab. And then, as I mentioned, we also have our best question prize going on today for another Amazon gift card, a $50 Amazon gift card. What that means is that you have to ask a question to be entered and, of course, meet the prize terms and conditions. And I mean, really, who doesn't have a question about ransomware, right? So that should be easy, an easy topic to ask about on the event. All right. So with that out of the way, I'm excited now to welcome today's two expert presenters. And let me bring them in here. Welcome first to Joshua Stenhouse, Field CTO at Rubrik, and Chris Kapusta, Senior Manager of Services for Insight. Josh and Chris, it's great to have you on. Chris, I'll first hand it off to you.
As David mentioned, we're going to talk a lot about ransomware today, a lot around recovery and how we get back to that working state. We'll go through the anatomy of a ransomware attack. I'm going to start off first, just to kind of set the tone here. I'm going to go over a little bit of who Insight is for those that are maybe unfamiliar, talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the market today as far as ransomware goes, why it's such a problem, at what scale are we seeing it, some strategies, and how we're helping our clients address not only the preventative side of ransomware, but also the planning and the recovery side as well. So for those unfamiliar with Insight, just a little bit of an infographic here on kind of who we are. We're a global solutions integrator, about 8,000 teammates, just under half of those in some type of technical capacity. And that could be architecture, that could be managed services, that could be support, that could be delivery. Did over 4,000 projects in 2021, on pace to blow right by that in 2022. You can see some of the awards that we've won there. So just a little bit of insight there to get us started. And then, let's really start to talk about how we're helping. Oops, let me see here. I had a slide snafu here. So let's talk about a little bit about kind of where does data live. Let's start there as we go through this today. So from a data perspective, you can see that about 90% of the data in history has been generated in the last 2 years. And, to compound that issue, data is residing in more places than ever. Traditionally, we're used to it residing inside of our own data centers. Now we're seeing, cloud came along, so now it's moved outside of the data center into the cloud, or even in a hybrid model existing across both of those planes. And then edge computing and edge resources are starting to pick up in popularity. So we're really moving from those data centers to centers of data. And, regardless of where that data resides, we have similar challenges on how we classify, protect, and if the need be, recover that data. And the farther we get outside of those data centers, the more hostile, I'll say, the environment becomes, the more difficult it becomes to manage lifecycle and protect that data. We're also seeing a huge uptick in kind of what I'll say are next generation type applications. So those AI and machine learning workloads that are out there. And while they offer a competitive edge in a lot of industries, they also really bring a unique challenge of the amount of data they generate is enormous. Not all of that data needs to be protected. So we really have to hone in on kind of how we classify that data, how we protect that data, how we recover that data, where does it live, where does it reside, and then how, as it moves further and further out into the edge, I mean, all the way into cars and trains now, if the need be, how do we recover in kind of those remote, somewhat hostile environments? And you can see some of the attributes, data has weight, data also has inertia. The more we generate, the more we move outside that data center and generate in those clouds and edge environments, it just seems, the inertia of that gets bigger and bigger. So we see more and more moving to those states. And as we look at kind of the ransomware problem, so it's expensive. We're seeing $5 billion in insurance premiums. You can see the average cost to mitigate a ransomware attack is just under $2 million. And the downtime and recovery time is usually 10x the ransomware payment. So it's not just the payment to get your data back; it's also the downtime and impact to the business to get back to operations. And what does that cost? And what can the business tolerate from a downtime perspective as you're trying to recover these resources? And that's really where with partners like Rubrik, where we talk about how we get back to that recovery state in a very fast manner, how we can even avoid paying those ransom payments, because what we've seen is a lot of work goes into developing that ransomware software that's going to encrypt or exfiltrate the data. Not a lot of engineering effort goes into that recovery software. So we've had a few clients that have paid the ransom, gotten access to the decryption software, only to find out, the way it was written, it was going to take weeks or longer to decrypt all of that data. So it ended up going back to recovering from backups anyway. So it's how do I do that in an expedient manner? How do I protect that data as I'm backing it up? How do I identify, where there's anomalies or concerns in that data? And then if the need does arise, how do I recover quickly? And so why is it so effective for criminals? I mean, we saw the numbers on the previous screen here. It's a lucrative business. If they weren't making money doing it, nobody would do it. And we've even seen they get more and more creative. It started off as kind of smash and grab opportunities. Someone would hack in, maybe steal a password or two and use that to compromise some systems. They get more sophisticated over time. We see rogue nation states get involved. Now we see ransomware as a service. There's money to be made in just writing the software that people use to break into other organizations. So it's become a very lucrative business. Social engineering is still sophisticated. We spend a lot of time, deploying perimeter defenses, virus scanning, email filtering, all of these kind of perimeter technologies to keep bad actors out. What we find is the weakest link is still someone who clicks that executable or clicks that link in an email or a Word doc or whatever the case may be. So social engineering is still, very, a very popular way of breaking into an environment. Poor operational hygiene. A lot of response plans are not realistic. We see that a lot of thought goes into how I prevent people from getting in, and a lot of organizations don't really put in thought of how do I recover. And it's much more than just how do I restore from my backups. It's who needs to be involved, who are their backups in case they're unavailable, what order of operations do I restore my environment in, how do I classify my applications and workloads into those different tiers to know, these are the mission critical ones that have to be restored first. And you have to develop that plan, but more importantly, you have to practice and execute that plan. I like to tell clients the first time you run your ransomware recovery plan can't be after a cyber incident, because it's going to be utter chaos. And if you haven't practiced that before, there's a very good chance you're not successful in those recovery efforts. So, methods being used, and I'm going to let Joshua kind of go through a lot of this when he talks about that anatomy of a ransomware attack. But, we've seen everything from encryption to exfiltration. Data encryption was kind of the first popular way of holding data hostage. And as clients became more and more kind of sophisticated, I'll say, in protecting and recovering that data, it became data exfiltration. That was the kind of next phase there. Okay, I'm not going to encrypt it. I'm just going to steal it and hold it for ransom if, and I'll release it if you don't pay me. And we've even seen some go as far as just data destruction. Forget stealing it, forget encrypting it. We're just going to break in and we're going to destroy everything. So that need to have a plan on how we recover and those methods of recovery become really important there. And really, it's no industry safe. It's affecting everybody. Now there's ebbs and flows based upon certain times of year, retail around the holidays. Healthcare is always a popular target, but as you can see from the stats here, really it's an industry wide problem that affects all of us. So we, regardless, there's no safe industry. So we all need a plan. We all need to make sure that we're protecting, classifying, and have the ability to restore those data, those applications, those workloads into a fully working state there. And really, what I wanted to highlight on this slide here is just it's no longer just one part of the organization or one part of our infrastructure even that's responsible for ransomware prevention. I think early on the mentality was, well, I'll deploy, it's a network problem. I'll deploy perimeter firewalls. I'll deploy content filtering. I'll deploy virus scanning and keep everything on the edge, kind of the perimeter kind of safe here. And then we found that, deeper that these bad actors get into the environment, the more protections we need along the way. So we need our storage devices participated in these security profiles to understand when there's intrusions or anomalous or bad data being written. We need our data protection environments to participate, to understand as they're examining data that's coming in through backups, are there anomalies in that? Are there malware in that? Is there things that are impacting the integrity of that data that we need to start to be aware of? So it's really, we should expect all of our infrastructure and really all of the organizations within our business to participate in these security postures and security profiles to prevent and recover from these cyber incidents. As we're out there talking to clients, we follow kind of the NIST cybersecurity framework. Obviously, we want everybody on the kind of left-hand side of this slide as we can, that identify and protect area is where a lot of our focus should go. We should still try to keep those bad actors out, but we do need good plans to detect, because as rogue actors get more and more sophisticated, we have to keep up with the methods they're using to break into environments. So we almost have to treat our ransomware response as a product that we develop internally. There's no such thing anymore as I deploy all these safeguards and I'm good. I never have to go back and look at them. Now I've got to go back and almost iterate it like a product, something I'm developing constantly to keep up with the changes that we're seeing out there from the bad actors. And then obviously respond and recover are really, kind of what we're here to talk about today, but it's becoming more and more important. A lot of insurance carriers are adjusting premiums and requirements to show that you can respond and recover from ransomware before they'll even insure you. Premiums are going up in general, so the more I can prepare my organization to not have to use the insurance or pay the ransom, I think the better off we all are. So, focusing on that part of the NIST framework today. And I'm going to skip this one here just to kind of talk about, key capabilities that we want to look for as we're protecting that data and having the ability to recover there. We obviously want data immutability. So once that data is written to my data protection environment, I want to make sure that it can't be compromised in any way. It can't be deleted before retention times. Nobody can encrypt or mess with that data in any way until those retention expirations expire. We need them to, as I mentioned earlier, we need these environments to start participating in that detection phase of our incident response. In a lot of cases, our data protection environment contains most, if not all, of a copy of an organization's data. So the more analysis, the more intelligence that it can bring to that conversation around detection and understanding what's normal backup workloads look like. What do anomalous backup workloads look like? When does there start to alert that there's cause for concern? We're seeing a lot of intelligence in products like Rubrik bring that to the security posture. And then remediation. When an attack occurs, the conversation becomes how quickly can I recover? And we really need to flip that conversation from it's no longer how long to restore files, folders, or systems. It's how long do I bring my entire organization back online? And that really has to be a well-documented plan. That has to be, kind of IT operations working with developers and the business to understand the importance of all the data. Classification of workloads becomes a key point here. So we really need to have a solid plan of not only how we recover, but how quickly we can recover if a cyber incident does occur. And last slide I have here before I turn it over to the main event. But if you're looking for help in this area, we have a number of data protection assessments. We've been doing this for 25 plus years. It's one of our pedigrees. If you're looking for, hey, confirmation, just give us confirmation that, yeah, we're in a good spot and we should have the ability to recover if an incident occurs, and we can help there. If it's help us find gaps or vulnerabilities or areas that we need to focus on to firm up our protection and response, we can help there as well. So happy to assist in any way that we can. And with that, Joshua, I'm going to turn it over to you so we can walk through that anatomy of a ransomware attack.
Thank you. Okay, so let's get into the meat of this presentation and look at what actually happens in a ransomware attack and what is the situation that you're going to be faced with, and then how can you prepare to be able to respond to this. So let's start by just agreeing on this premise that it would be pretty naive of us to think that every single ransomware attack that's ever happened is because they didn't have sufficient protection. Everybody has firewalls. Everybody has at least endpoint protection as a minimum. Yet somehow these attackers are still able to get in. And it's because there's always multiple routes inside a data center. So the first thing to say is that if you removed every single thing that allowed access into a data center, so VPNs, any sort of remote desktop service, even on-premise Exchange, which is consistently proven as a route into your data center, or just basically any internal web service. If you can remove all of them today and remove email access from any internal system while on your network, then I think it's safe to say that you might be okay. But if you can't do that, then you have to presume that you will be breached, because between that and zero-day vulnerabilities, unpatched systems, and humans, you have to presume that what if our defenses fail? Even if you go out and buy the best endpoint protection software and solution in the world today, you're still betting the entire house on that will not fail and will not be compromised. And that's still not enough, because you have to presume breach and presume that everything will fail. And so if you look at everything will fail and presume breach, then what is an attacker going to do, and what do you need to have a plan for? What is your backup plan for security defenses failing? So an attacker will establish persistence, they will traverse the network, and they will move vertically to any cloud authenticated resources. And what I can tell you as part of being in a response to over 100 ransomware attacks, what I can tell you is that if you have Active Directory, it's gone. They will have domain admin, and think about what a domain admin can do, what is that connected to, and where could I go with it? Wherever the domain admin can go, the attacker can now go. So if you start thinking about that alone, it's immediately going to change the game on how you view what happens in response to an attack. But as soon as they get the elevated permissions and domain admin, the first thing they're going to do is actually exfiltrate any accessible data on the network. And now for some organizations like a hospital, pretty easy to see where sensitive data might be a significant risk here. But even if you're a completely private organization, not even any sort of potential like PHI health information, you still have PII in your employee data. So employees' names, addresses, their salaries, their social security numbers, their names and information of their spouses on health insurance. And it's pretty easy for any attacker to quickly identify where I need to get the bulk of the PII for just your employees alone. And quite handily, we all have a department called HR. I search for HR, I look at their home drives, their shares, their files, and bang, I'm pretty sure that any attacker can get PII of employees pretty quick once on the network. So you basically have to presume that everything that is online and accessible on that network is now going to be potentially exfiltratable. And once they finish the exfiltration, oh, and by the way, attackers also use backup platforms now as a source of exfiltration. So if you're unaware of that, Google backup platform or backup exfiltration and look, for example, at Conti, and you can see the targets that they use. But furthermore, they will then come for all of your backups and snapshots, because it's pretty easy to say that as an attacker, as a 1-2 punch, one, I steal all of your data that I deem critical, and then two, I log in and delete and expire all of your backups and snapshots. And then, as long as I put in, as an attacker, a reasonable ransom, where it's not like $50 million, it's more of like the couple 100,000 to max a couple million, depending on your size, then all the attacker is doing is massively increasing their chances of just, hey, they've hit us so hard, we have to pay. But do not have any doubt that if a backup admin can log in, a domain admin can log in as a backup admin, then most definitely that is the route that they will take, and they're going to remove your ability to recover. And anything on that Active Directory domain, any Windows server, you have to consider compromised. And next, they encrypt the data and leave the ransom. So at this point, this is probably going to be a Saturday morning when you face this situation. Absolute war zone. You come in and everybody realizes that you've been attacked, and now you're facing Armageddon. You're facing Armageddon. And the first thing you need to ensure is that if the attacker gets in, how do you make sure that you have a survivable copy of your data? How do you make sure that all of your backup data, not just a subset, because there's some organizations that say, well, I'm going to protect the top 20% of my environment. And I think, well, that's great. But are you saying that the other 80% of your environment is disposable in an attack? No, that's not true. You need to make sure that 100% of your data is survivable and cannot be attacked or expired in any shape or form by the attacker. But the interesting thing here is, for a lot of organizations, number one is not true today. So if number one is not true, I'm going to take you through everything you need to make it true and why you need it. But the unfortunate news I have for you is that even if you have number one, that doesn't mean that your downtime and your impact still isn't going to be measured in weeks and millions. Because, okay, let's say you get a survivable copy of the data. It means that, okay, you got the backups, but which ones do you use? From what point in time are you even going to recover from? So that is only problem statement number one. And what my experience and the experience of Rubrik has taught me is that, hey, we've had number one down for now the last 7 years in the market. And what we can tell you is that after having that for 7 years and seeing over 100 attacks, that it is not enough. It is not enough to just say I'm immutable. Yes, you got to start there, but that isn't going to mean that anyone's going to have a raise or even a job to come back to at the end of it. So the second problem statement is, if your endpoint protection has failed to stop an attacker encrypting data, there is encrypted data on your network right now, your endpoint protection has failed or has been bypassed, whatever. What was encrypted? What is the blast radius of that attack? That is the first question that you're going to have to answer. How bad is the damage here? But then the next question is, the ransom note says, well, I have your data and I'm going to release it. So the next question from your superiors in the board is going to be, well, what did they steal? And then furthermore, then when can we recover to? So the fourth problem statement is, well, how do I identify a clean recovery point and not reinfect my environment? But then what is the process to actually do this? Because, okay, let's say I do know that my data was encrypted last night, of course, because that's when everything slowed down. That's when I started seeing interruptions in services and ransom notes. Yes, of course, I know I've been encrypted. But that doesn't mean you can just recover to yesterday. You're just going to reintroduce the attacker into your environment. So what is your plan for identifying a clean recovery point and how are you going to do it? And then furthermore, problem statement number 5, once you've made that decision, how are you going to automate it? How are you going to do it, test, and prove that you can do this in advance? So if you could take one point away from this slide, it's that if you don't have immutability, you need it. But immutability alone of your backups does not mean that anyone's going to come out of this looking awesome, because you also need to answer 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I'm going to take you through all 5 of these for the remainder of the session and give you tips and tricks as I go along from everything that I've learned as part of being response to over the 100 attacks. But let's start with number 1. And if we're going to start with number 1, we have to address a few key terms here, because you're going to hear lots of common terms from data protection vendors, and they all say similar things, but they can actually mean very different things in practice. And my favorite first example is air gapping. In that, for me, just to level set on the table right now, anything other than a tape is 100% not an air gap. You're saying the term, but there is most definitely no air there. There is a physical connection. There is some form of isolation or logical separation, but it is not an air gap. Yet in the industry, we have vendors that sell physically cabled solutions that have some sort of periodic turn-off or isolation, and everybody seems to accept that as an air gap. Quite ironically, you could use a wireless network and say, well, that's an air gap, but that doesn't count either. So if we just accept air gap actually means logical separation or isolation, I think everybody can agree that, one, it is still valuable, because if I say no air gap or isolation, I mean that the backup data is online and accessible from a compromised operating system in the environment. If I say logical air gap, I mean that yes, the data is physically connected, but no, it can't be accessed. And I'll talk about a little bit more about what that means on the next slide. But if we say physical air gap, even though I don't agree with it, the industry generally accepts that as long as you're physically disconnecting the backups, even if it's just for a period of the day, that counts as an air gap in isolation. But you can't just consider air gapping alone. You also need immutability. And again, this is where it gets interesting, because everybody in the world, me too, says, oh, I can give you immutability. But the key question you have to ask here is, well, how are you immutable? And what do you mean by that? Because there's a significant number of backup vendors that will say, well, I'm immutable. And what they actually mean is that they're immutable at the file system level. So yes, if an attacker compromises an operating system, they cannot edit or encrypt your data. An important attack vector, but actually not the number one attack vector, because if an insurance underwriter asks you to prove immutability, they won't say, can you log in at the operating system and encrypt the data? They will say, no, can you log in as a backup admin and show me that you cannot prematurely expire the backups? So that's why you can't just have immutability at the file system level. You need to combine it with a retention lock to prohibit a backup admin just simply dropping the retention, and NTP protection to protect against just jumping the clock. And it's only when you put all 3 of these together that you can say, I have a 100% immutable backup. And you got to watch out, because there are publicly traded companies that say I'm immutable, and they're only referring to the first column, not the other 2. And it's all of them together that are going to give you that ability to make that statement. So if we look at how are you going to do this inside your data center, and actually, if you talk about cloud workloads, I think it's very easy in cloud to make data and backups immutable. Everything's a snapshot, everything done by API. There's 100 different vendors, and hey, Rubrik has a good solution here, but yeah, there's many different point solutions that can do it too. But it's ironic that, you know, at the end of 2022, the biggest risk vector for me is not the cloud. The cloud has isolated networking, a lot of isolation in data, a lot of immutability in snapshots. The biggest risk vector is everything in your data center, especially if that data center has VPNs and RDP and Citrix and Horizon and Exchange, yada, yada. So if you look at that data inside that data center, the last line of defense of your business is backup. If everything else fails, you're going to go to backup. But you look at those backup technologies and they were designed 10, 20, 30 years ago. They were not designed with an attacker in mind. So no air gap, no immutability, no retention lock. And all that means is that the data is online and accessible by an operating system on your network. Strike one. An attacker can get at the underlying operating system. There are examples of attackers being able to decrypt passwords for Active Directory from backup platforms themselves. Next, they'll just drop the retention, either by saying, hey, only keep 1 day of backups, or jump the clock and have the backup platform kill itself by just dropping the retention. But they'll also use the data and the credentials as a source of exfiltration. And what I can tell you today, unfortunately, is that if you do not have a 100% truly immutable backup platform in your production environment, if you do nothing, you will lose 100% of your data in an attack. But what you got to consider is, well, how can I strengthen this approach? So this is where Rubrik comes in, and we say, hey, we have a natively air-gapped immutable system whereby we're not just giving you the backup software, we're also giving you a fully converged appliance. So it's both the hardware, the operating system, the backup software, and the scale-out backup storage together. And it's interesting because you go back a couple of years and some people still considered this as a negative against, well, why would I do this when I have to replace everything? And it's actually now come full circle in that that's now the biggest reason why, is that if you want to truly harden your backup repository, the only way to do it is a secure, hardened Linux converged backup software and scale out backup storage approach. If you don't do that, if you just have one of those elements, and it means that all the other elements are completely compromisable and all controls go out the window. It is the only way to secure the data. And what this approach means is that once you standardize on a natively air-gapped and immutable converged solution, is that your backup data cannot be physically accessed from any compromised operating system inside the environment. So the attacker could compromise every single Windows, every single Linux server in your environment, but they cannot access the underlying backup data. So you have a built-in native logical air gap where, yes, the data is physically connected, but no, it cannot be accessed. And furthermore, you also need to make sure that it's natively immutable. So this is actually built into Rubrik since day one. This is built in at a point where nobody even knew what immutability was, but now it's the most important thing. And this is not a licensed extra. It's not run periodically. It's built in, whereby you cannot edit or encrypt any backup once it's written, and it's natively immutable. And it's this 1-2 punch that means that you physically cannot do anything as an attacker to remove your ability to recover, but you still have to protect the logins to the backup interface itself, which is on the network. So for that, mandatory MFA on all logins. Do all backup admins love it? No, but you have to do this because it's the last line of defense of your business. But you've also got to make sure you have a local account that you can log into irrespective of whatever directory service is available, usually AD, because like I said, AD is going to be down, it's going to be compromised. So you need a local account, and that local account also has to have MFA. So at Rubrik, we do it using built-in TOTP. Scan a QR code, you've secured that account, but you got to make sure that that local TOTP doesn't have some email reset capability, because if it does, an attacker will just reset it and log in anyway, and you're as good as toast. But that still doesn't prohibit a backup admin from dropping or expiring the retention, which is actually the primary attack vector. So you've also got to make sure you have built-in retention lock and NTP protection. So this means that even an authenticated backup admin that got past your MFA still can't prematurely expire backups. And you have to do this because between MFA fatigue, SIM swapping, social engineering, or just unconfigured accounts, you have to presume the MFA might be bypassed. So you can't rely on MFA alone. And you also have to mitigate any risk of somebody just jumping the clock and having the backups expire anyway. But the good news that I can tell you is that if you take this approach, and that between the native posture of secure hardened Linux, logical air gap, native immutability, retention lock, and NTP protection, that 100% of your data is now recoverable from an attack from the first copy for the fastest recovery time objective. And anybody that tells you, well, you need a physical air gap or a data vault, the reason that they're doing that is because they cannot escape the fundamental problem here that the first copy of the data is completely compromisable and there's nothing they can do to get out of it other than say you need an extra copy on a physical air gap. So that's why it's really important to look at the different architectural options that you have for additional data redundancy. So number one, I'm saying everybody, as a bare minimum, you can't just have one copy of the data. You need to have multiple, even if just for standard best practices in data protection. So my number one recommended protection and architecture is a local immutable copy and a cloud immutable copy. Now, the cloud cannot be your only immutable copy, because what I can tell you then is that you're most definitely going to be weeks of downtime and lose your job, because you're presuming that you even know the correct recovery point to download from the cloud before you even take the multiple days to download it. So number one, guarantees job security and the best security posture. You have a local immutable copy, a cloud immutable copy, and this also mitigates any supply chain risk, because an attacker would have to compromise the likes of a Microsoft or an Azure and your backup provider to compromise all copies. Not going to happen. But it doesn't really give you a good DR plan, which is where number two comes in, where you say, hey, I'm going to do bidirectional replication between different data vaults with immutability, so I also get disaster recovery. But the most common architecture that I see deployed and I recommend is number three, both. Both gives you long-term retention, cheap object storage in the cloud, it's immutable, retention locked, and disaster recovery. But then we come to the curveball number four, whereby you say, I need a physical air gap. Well, the first thing I come back to and say, hey, why are you doing that? If you're doing that to protect your backups, then you've got the wrong backup platform. Come and talk to Rubrik. If you're doing it to build an isolated recovery environment, again, you probably still got the wrong backup platform, because there are capabilities that, for example, Rubrik can do that mitigate that. But if you have the budget and want to build an IRE in a physical air gap, Rubrik can do it. We have a solution in the space. We usually only see it in large financials and banking customers, but the physical air gap should not be required for any IRE or any protection of backups. That should be built in and done from the first copy. But if you want to go down that route, we have a solution. Gladly sell it to you. But I'm only on problem statement number one of protecting your backups and making them immutable. And again, the most important thing, if you don't have it today, you got to get to number one. But once you get to number one, you cannot rest on your laurels. You have to think, well, okay, let's say I am attacked and I have my immutable backups. Then the next question is, well, what has been encrypted? So this is where you have to watch out, because one thing you're going to hear a lot in the data protection space is, well, I'm going to give you anomaly detection. And the problem with anomaly detection is that, quite frankly, it's useless. Put that in your notes. Anomaly equals useless. You know why? Because all an anomaly in a backup means is that a larger than normal amount of data has changed. This happens every day, thousands of times a week in a large organization. So if all you do is create anomalies and send them out, especially to a security team, you're creating noise. 99.999% will all be false positives, noise, turned off and ignored. So you can't just take anomalies and flag them. But furthermore, neither can you take anomalies and say, well, actually, my solution is I'm going to scan every file every day. Because if you think about operating system files alone, you're talking billions of files. You cannot scan every file and hope to even complete that in a week. So a strategy of scanning every file doesn't work either. So the perfect in between that you got to look for, and this is what Rubrik does, of course, is that you've got to start with the anomaly and say, I'm not just going to immediately flag that, but what Rubrik does is takes that anomaly and then immediately does the second level scan and looks inside the files themselves. So not just the metadata. Of course, you can't just look at the metadata. You've got to scan the actual file, look at its entropy and randomization. And what Rubrik can do is tell you, hey, this isn't just Joe Blog deleting 200,000 files, which might be of use to a data protection team, but definitely not to a security team. But say, no, this is actually a encryption attack. These are the 5,000 servers that were just encrypted, and these are the 10,000 files in it that they actually perform the encryption on, whether it's full or partial. And what you got to make sure is that this is built into the backup platform. Because as soon as you're using third-party software, all that means is that you're delaying the time to detection. And when you consider the fact that this is already in the backup, so it's after the fact, one, yes, it's a very good use case to consider backing up more frequently, but two, it still means it's after the fact. So the time to give you the result is of the utmost importance because it means everything else has failed. So with Rubrik, its detection is done within 15 minutes of each backup cycle, and we can take this alert and plug it into your SIM or SOAR tooling, and the most common method for surfacing it to security teams is via webhook. Everyone can receive this pre-built integrations into likes of Cortex XOR, Splunk, ServiceNow, etc. But you got to make sure that this is surfaced to the SOC because, okay, it was detected in backups, but you got to make sure that you're surfacing it to your security team. But furthermore, by building this into your backup process, this also means that your list of what was encrypted is already ready to then drive the recovery in the platform that would drive the recovery. Because if you're telling me that you're just going to create a CSV that would then have to be manually imported, all you're doing is slowing down recovery. So you got to make sure that you can surgically remediate and recover only the infected data from the recovery platform without a manual process. But one really important thing here, that this is still the end of the kill chain. If you hear any data protection vendor talk about this as though it's now the golden savior of every organization, then you can tell them from me they don't know what they're talking about. Because what I can tell you in an attack is that even if you have this turned on, you're seeing alert, 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 alert. I know I'm being encrypted. But the key problem I have is, well, what does the attacker have control of? I can't just recover to yesterday. I'm going to reintroduce the attacker, the remote access tooling, their backdoors. So it is still valuable to know what was encrypted, but 100% it is not recommended for operating system level recovery, whether it's physical or virtual. And yes, it does reduce the start time to recovery for files, NAS, and unstructured data. But for anything with an operating system, do not be fooled. Any sort of anomaly or encryption detection is absolutely useless in an attack in deciding a clean recovery point for anything other than files, definitely not for operating systems. So the next problem statement is, well, okay, the attacker says, I have your data, I'm going to release it. So then you have this problem, well, okay, well, what was exfiltrated? And what I can tell you from my experience is that you can invest in all the DLP, data loss prevention tooling you could ever imagine, and it is all absolutely useless. In the UK, we have a good saying, chocolate fire guard, because, okay, fine, DLP is great at stopping an employee leaving with a spreadsheet. But if an attacker has established a backdoor in your environment and an encrypted tunnel, what I can tell you is that nothing can tell you what was stolen. So what you see is that you have to infer from what was on your network and what they had access to, as this is now the minimum that I have to presume is exfiltrated. So the secret weapon that Rubrik has and that you should look for in your backup platform is the ability to identify what is on my network. So our secret weapon at Rubrik is that we can scan inside the backups and tell you exactly what is on your network with over 60 pre-built policies for all the common data types. This is not an app, it's not an extra, it's not roadmap. We've been doing this multiple years, and what we can tell you is that this is the sensitive information that you have, and we're doing it from your backups inside your data center. We're not sending it elsewhere. We're not loading extra apps for different vendors. We're built in. You can also put your own custom policies and search for any existing tagging that you might be doing, because even if you already have some sort of data classification tool, it's usually only against the top 30, 40% anyway. The attack vector is 100% your environment, so you have to scan 100%, which is in your backups. But the critical thing you've got to look for and why you need it in backup is that in the event of the attack, you've got to be able to combine the view on the encrypted files with the sensitive data, because that is the minimum that you have to presume is exfiltrated. And now the question becomes, well, what was in it? Because if they could encrypt it, they most definitely could access it. And if they could access it, you have to presume it was exfiltrated. So what was in it? And what I can tell you is that it's too late to ask this question after the fact, because what you'll see from any IR team, incident response, is that if all your data has been encrypted and you ask them, well, what was stolen? The first thing they'll tell you is, well, recover it first, and then we'll tell you what was in it. Too late, elongated, the horse already bolted, they already stole it. So the biggest value of actually ensuring sensitive data discovery in your backups is your ability to then use this proactively to mitigate the risk in the first place and remove sensitive data wherever you can. But none of this answers the fundamental question of, well, how do I identify a clean recovery point? And this is actually the biggest tabletop mistake that I see in every organization I ever speak to. And you should put this in your notes right now. You cannot presume recovery point. You can't recover to yesterday, but that definitely doesn't mean you can't recover to 2 days, 3 days, 4 days ago either. What if the recovery point was 5, 6, 7? Okay, granted, the median dwell time of an attacker for a ransomware attack in North America is 5 days in the last year. It's rare you go that much beyond it, but it's fair to say you definitely can't pick a recovery point with 0 to 5 days of any certainty. And this is actually where you're going to lose the majority of your recovery time, because you don't know which is a zombie versus a victim. Which servers does the attacker have control of, which is a server that was just encrypted. And then furthermore, a lot of organizations don't have an IRE, an isolated recovery environment, to start trying to recover everything and scan at scale. And furthermore, then the big question is, well, how long will this take? Because what you typically see is that backup teams think, well, somebody's going to magically tell me a recovery point and I only have to do one recovery, and then fantastic, we've recovered from ransomware attack. Not true. You're actually going to have to likely do multiple recoveries. And this is true for any backup platform in the world today, because if you can't identify a clean recovery point that is free from malware or the RATs, the remote access tools, you're going to have to do multiple recoveries and scans to make that determination. So what you got to make sure is that you have the ability to threat hunt and scan for indicators of compromise inside your backups. Now, this didn't exist until a year ago, until Rubrik brought it to market, but it's an absolute game changer, because what we're saying and what we've proven as the biggest benefit in response to a ransomware attack is that you need the ability to scan for threats inside a backup to reduce the time to recovery point selection and your overall recovery point. Because what we're saying is that via Yara rule engine, which also accepts files, paths, extensions, and hashes, we can actually give you the ability to scan your backups in their offline state for the IRCs and do so across a time series. And this is pretty important because anyone can do threat hunting and IRC scanning in a production environment with the right tools, but you can only scan today. You can only scan right now. And in an attack, that's no use. I know now is compromised. I need to find my clean recovery point. So that's why you've got to be able to do this across the time series. And the only way to do that without a lengthy effort of multiple restores is to have it built into backup. But it also means that you don't need to go and build this fantastically expensive isolated recovery environment to try and recover your whole environment to then scan and make this determination. No, it's built in. But it also means that you can identify an entry point, what are zombies versus victims, and a clean recovery point per server. It also gives you the ability to proactively hunt for threats and not just use this in response to an attack. But the biggest benefit of them all is quickly identify a clean recovery point to only recover once. But importantly, you shouldn't just be doing this in response to an attack. You got to make sure that you're doing this in advance. So either from a predefined recovery plan, you also have the ability to ad hoc do this from a threat hunt and test, either by a live mount or pre-hydrate virtual machines for disaster recovery, simulate a recovery from an attack to an isolated network, prove that you can recover via PDF reporting saying, hey, I have an immutable backup, and this is my recovery time, recover for forensics, recover to production, hold for legal. All of this, you've got to make sure is built in, because these are the 5 key requirements for your cyber recovery. You've got to make sure that you have immutable backups, number 1, without doubt. But as I said, immutable backups alone are not going to save anyone's job. You got to make sure that you can detect and identify the blast radius of the encryption attack, discover sensitive data within the backups, identify a clean recovery point, and then orchestrate the recovery, test, and improve this in advance. But so far, everything I've spoken about so far is just technologies and a process. You've also got to make sure that you have the team and the backing that are able to drive it. Because one thing I think we can all be pretty confident in saying is that the majority of organizations today do not have an IT team with 10 or even 2, 5, 15, whatever, pick your number of people that are all battle hardened and have been through multiple ransomware attacks. No, quite the opposite. Everybody, for the majority, has never been through one. I hope they never go through one, but what I can guarantee is that it's the most stressful event in your life and a huge learning moment. So you've also got to make sure that you have somebody to call. So everything I covered so far, yes, Rubrik can do, bring us in and will help you get all of this fixed. But if I was going to pick one biggest differentiator of why you need to consider Rubrik in helping you in this journey, is that if you are attacked, you call Rubrik support, say, hey, I've been hit, and then you have immediate access to our ransomware response team, over 100 recoveries. That is priceless alone in that experience being on tap, and they stay with you until you no longer need them. Every single Rubrik customer gets this. Just being part of support and maintenance, it's not a chargeable extra. And that in itself is just as valuable as the technology in the first place, where, yeah, okay, you got to have the technology to have something to recover, but it's no good if my whole team have never been through an attack and know what to do and how to get it back. So you've also got to make sure that you have an extension of your team and able to do that. And if any of that is of interest, get in touch with Rubrik right away and our fantastic partner in Insight, and we'll be happy to engage you and give you a more detailed breakdown of how that's going to work. But with that, coming towards the end of my slot, so we have a famous phrase at Rubrik, don't back up, go forward. At that point, I'd like to bring back in David, and I believe we've got a Q&A.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great presentation. This is really one to certainly take notes on. Go back and watch the recording after the event because there's just so much to learn here. I've brought back in Chris as well, and we're ready to take some questions from the audience. We got a lot of great questions coming in. I know if you have a question, this is the right time to get it in. If you're thinking about it, just drop it there in the questions box, and we'll do our best here in the time left to get to as many of these as we can. Let's see, where do I start? First one, this one's, I think, good from Heath, and maybe this is for both of you. You know, he said he's responsible for risk analysis at his company. With the increasing use of cloud services for data storage, how can we judge vendors for their ransomware preparedness prior to engaging with them? What questions should we ask? So when it comes to asking questions of your vendors and considering them as part of your ransomware plan, what should you be asking if you were in Heath's shoes? Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess from Heath's question, if you're worried about what questions you should ask your cloud or SaaS provider, I think you'll get a pretty kind of similar answer from all of them. Is it's your responsibility for the data you store and that tendency to protect it. Their ransomware strategy is they will protect physical access to the data center and systems. You know, for everything else, it's kind of the ball's in your court. Now, for some of the SaaS applications out there, I think it's key to ask those vendors, what does your cyber response look like? A lot of them should have that documented. A lot of them should be willing to share that, maybe not publicly, but at least as part of those conversations as you're looking to bring new services on board. Ask them to see what their cyber response looks like, and how they plan to recover if there's data loss. I think those are valid questions.
Yeah, great point. And Josh, if I'm considering a ransomware recovery solution, you probably gave, a 12 different things to look for there, but, kind of what's the top thing that I need to be asking?
I think if I was going to surmise my entire presentation, is that the first point is still the most pertinent, in that if you have nothing to recover, everything else goes out the window. So you can't just take the word immutability at face value. You have to say, how are you immutable? And how would you stop an attacker, even if authenticating as a backup admin, from dropping, expiring, or jumping the clock and removing my ability to recover? Because it's still one of the biggest failings I see in all teams is just checking a box saying, hey, are you immutable? Yes. And that is not a definitive answer. You have to say how. So if you're going to take one thing, it would be that. Ask how and make sure you're checking every attack vector.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. I mean, so many things when it comes to looking for recovery solutions are not just checkbox features. Rapid recovery, check. Ransomware protection, check. You got to dig a whole lot deeper into exactly how these things work. Let's see what else. Another good question here. Maybe this one's for you, Josh. They want to know what good are backups if the attacker has already exfiltrated the data?
I love that question, and I get it very frequently, because the answer is they're not, unless you can actually scan those backups to determine what sensitive data was at risk. Because it's fair to say we've actually helped clients who haven't even got a handle on sensitive data, who have been encrypted. IR team has said, well, I can't scan anything because it's encrypted. And we've come in and said, well, we can tell you what was in the backups and what was in the network, and this is now what was at risk from exfiltration. So that's why you've got to make sure that you can scan for sensitive data inside backups, because that might be all you've got when you're faced with that question of what was exfiltrated.
Yeah, great point. And Chris, what about the question of cost? How much can these types of attacks cost companies? I've seen it, all over the place. What are you seeing?
Yeah, and we showed a slide early on. The average remediation cost is 1.8 million. It's all over the place, because there is the ransom cost if you're forced to pay that, but there is also the downtime cost of what does it take to remediate and get back to operation. And for a lot of organizations, it could mean going out of business. And then there's kind of I'll say unmeasurable cost, and it's brand reputation. So if you're in the headlines that you've been hit by a ransomware attack, and data's been exfiltrated, and now data's been compromised, that takes a big hit to your reputation, and there's a lot you have to do to rebuild that trust. So I think the cost kind of varies, depending on severity, how far that actor was able to get in, and then you almost have that I'll say immeasurable cost of brand reputation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I've seen I know like the city of Atlanta, they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars just on PR services to try to help improve their
Yep.
reputation, during the attack and afterwards. So, yeah, like you said, the costs are really kind of immeasurable. Um, Josh, what about, let's see, they say here, I have immutable backups or I plan to implement them. Then why would I need anything else?
Yeah, and that's probably the next biggest lesson, is that I can tell you from seeing, well, from 100 attacks, if you have immutable backups from day one, it still doesn't mean anybody is coming out of that situation looking awesome. Your downtime is still going to be weeks and millions if you don't know which backups to use. So you have to make sure it's not just immutable backups, but the ability to scan inside them and determine what to recover, what is clean, what isn't, what is sensitive, what isn't, because these are all the problems you have. Just saying, oh, I can recover to yesterday is basically a surefire way to guarantee a failed recovery and even more impact.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of like I've heard the question like, well, I have cyber insurance. why should I care about anything else? Well, it's kind of like you don't really want your house to burn down just because you have, insurance in case it does happen. Just because you have backups, there's a whole lot more to keep in mind. So many great questions out here, but I'm afraid we're running out of time here. Josh, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'm glad you said the cyber insurance one. Is that I actually have a good example of a very known publicized company where they paid the cyber insurance because they had it. But lo and behold, these attackers don't build the tools for speed of decryption. So they ended up using their backups anyway, and we definitely came and helped them. So even if you have the insurance, you can't rely on that anyway. But yeah, like be prepared. Don't rely on the insurance. You can't guarantee that they're even going to have a working decryptor, and you got to have a backup plan for if all of your lines of defense fail.
Great point. Chris, any final thoughts you want to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll echo a lot of what Josh said. Is have a plan, work the plan, practice the plan. As you move further down that NIST cybersecurity framework, you're getting more and more to your last resorts, as I like to put it, and eventually you'll run out of last resorts. So the more you can prepare, the more you can continue to work on prevention of intrusions, and then firm up your recovery efforts. The less you'll have to rely on those last resorts. So I'll echo a lot of what Joshua said there.
Great point. Great point. All right. Well, Chris and Josh, excellent presentation today. Thank you so much for being on the event. And of course, thank you to our friends at Rubrik and Insight for supporting the webinar today. I encourage everyone to check out the handouts there for additional information. Chris and Josh, thanks for being on. I'll go ahead and move on to our final thing here on the event, and that is our prize announcement. We've got our Amazon $300 gift card. This is going out to Danielle Oberman from Wisconsin. Congratulations, Danielle Oberman from Wisconsin. We'll reach out to you. Don't forget about the resources there in the handouts tab for additional information. I hope everyone learned a lot on the event today. Stay safe, protect yourself from ransomware, prevent it any way you can, and make sure you're prepared to recover, if you're hit. See you next time, and have a great day.